Welcome to the IFF 2018 On-Demand webinar series. This is the second presentation in the series, Building Subrecipient Fiscal Monitoring Systems, Processes and Tools in Idaho and Kansas.
My name is Jana Rossborough, and I'm a Senior Program Associate at WestEd. I'm a member of the National Center for Systemic Improvement, the Fiscal Support Team, and I also am on CIFER, which is the Center for IDA Fiscal Reporting today. I'm joined today by two colleagues from Idaho and Kansas, respectively, and I will have them introduce themselves. Let's start with Anthony.
Hi, everybody. My name is Anthony Mukuna. I'm the Funding and Accountability Coordinator here at the Idaho State Department of Education for Special Education. So I'm really excited to be part of this presentation again.
Hello, everyone. My name is Dean Zeitz, and I am the State and Federal Programs Coordinator here at the Kansas Department of Education.
The presentation objectives today is to provide a high-level overview of the federal requirements of a fiscal monitoring system. That will be very brief, but I'll give you some citations that you can look at and reference as Anthony and Dean are talking. We're going to share successes, challenges, and opportunities of implementing and continuously improving fiscal monitoring systems at the SBA level. And then really kind of cool in a way to kind of think through this and make this really real will be describing and demonstration of different tools and processes that support the implementation of an effective fiscal monitoring system. So really understand why this one was a requested repeat, because what Anthony and Dina offer is really powerful in terms of looking at your own system. So here comes the overview from a really high level, and I'll make this really pretty quick. A lot of this is driven from the Uniform Grant Guidance, right? And that is a place where across the federal government came together to develop some guidance to ease administrative burden in terms of the administrations of grants, and also strengthen the oversight of federal funds to reduce risks of waste, fraud, and abuse. And that kind of comes into that risk matrix, right, that we're going to talk about, and will come out through the different state stories. And also, and that's importantly, to increase the efficiency and effectiveness of federal financial assistance to ensure best use of federal funds. So how do we ensure that the funds are being used for their intended purpose and are advancing the objectives we want them to? How do we know that the funds are being used to drive results? And so the Uniform Grant Guidance was an attempt to kind of look across all federal programs, to pull them together, to keep the best parts, and to really say to states, and in this case in education, how exactly can we look across our funds usage to determine where to allocate our resources. So here's a citation that I want to direct you to in the Uniform Grant Guidance, and it's 2 CFR 200.300, and this is on the post-award requirements. So some highlights from that section are procurement standards. So how exactly do you look at how that money is being spent, what contracting and all of those kind of pieces of the actual use of those award funds. Monitoring and reporting of program performance, which will be a highlight of what we talk about today. Subrecipient monitoring and requirements for pass-through entities, because you as an SBA are a pass-through entity, and that's for those funds flowing to your subrecipients who are your LEAs. Right? For I know there's sometimes a little bit of difference in where they go, but for all intents and purposes, we'll call those the LEAs. And record retention and access. So as Anthony and Dean are highlighting their system today, please note that this is all couched within the Uniform Grant Guidance, and be happy to have additional conversations on that at any time. So with that said, I'm going to go ahead and turn this over to Anthony so we can dive into the first state system, which is Idaho. So thank you so much, Anthony.
Yeah, thank you so much, Jenna. Okay, yeah. So now let's talk about Idaho. So I joined the Idaho State Department of Education last year in May, and I had the opportunity to spend 1 week with my predecessor. And during the transition, I realized that we had a need to implement a fiscal monitoring system that was in line with the Uniform Grant Guidance. So I had a discussion with our state director, and then we started working on a plan. And the purpose of the plan for fiscal monitoring was to set some standards for fiscal monitoring and oversight here at the State Department of Education for special education. And we also wanted to standardize all our evaluation and monitoring guidelines so that they could be applied consistently to all the LEAs. And we also wanted to clearly identify all the different components of our subrecipient fiscal monitoring. And then as we were working through this plan, transparency was a key. We wanted to make it transparent so that everybody, all the LEAs, knew what were the criteria, what were the tools or documentation that we were going to use when we go to a fiscal monitoring activity with one of them, because it was really important to get their input and also to make this process transparent. So when we worked and finalized the plan, we put together a fiscal monitoring policies and procedure manual, and that manual is available in our state, in our website. And if you are interested to read and see what we do, you can go to the State Department of Education website and look for special education link, and you can find that manual there. But in the coming slide here, I'll just do a summary of the different process and tools that we use under our fiscal monitoring system here in Idaho. So fiscal monitoring is a component of technical assistance, because the goal is to provide technical assistance. We want to see what LEAs are doing, to see and where we can help them, where we can provide some help. So under the procedure and methodology that we use for our fiscal monitoring, we have the ongoing technical assistance every time we have a conversation by email or by phone call with an LEA, providing guidance and recommendation. I mean, we're providing technical assistance. It's all a component of fiscal monitoring. And we also have the preliminary risk assessment that is done through the review of the annual IDE Part B and preschool application. And what was new under the plan, we wanted to come up with a systematic way to do our desk and field reviews. By desk review, I mean we do a review of accounting and fiscal records remotely. So we have the LEA submitting files to through an application here, and then we perform all the review from the office and have conversations through phone or email. And we also have the field review, and it's a more thorough review of accounting and fiscal records. That is followed by an on-site visit at the district. So what was the criteria that we were going to use to determine which LEA will be subject to a fiscal monitoring in a given fiscal year? So the selection method we use are the sequential sampling monitoring selection method and the risk-based monitoring selection method, which is more in line with the new requirements in the Uniform Grant Guidance. So now let's talk about the sequential sampling monitoring. It's pretty simple. We have all the LEAs here in the state of Idaho. So we divided them in 4, and then we have a first group that will be selected in year 1. We have a second group that will be selected in year 2, third group in year 3, and then fourth group in year 4. And we just go through a sequence every year. That's how we determine who will be selected for a fiscal monitoring. And what is the criteria that we use to determine if it's going to be a desk or a field review? It is the size of the grants. LEA receiving less than $750,000 most likely will be subject to a desk review. LEA receiving a grant between $750,000 and $1.5 could be subject to a desk or field review. We will use other criteria and judgments to make the determination. But if an LEA received more than 1.5, then when time comes for fiscal monitoring, it will be a field review. And what is the benefit of this selection method? Every LEA will go through this process at least one time every 4 years. The second selection method is using the risk-based approach, which is pretty simple. We do a fiscal risk assessment at the beginning of the fiscal year using risk indicators to try to assess the level of risk. And then with our risk assessment, the total amount of points that an LEA could get is 60. And then if an LEA ends up with a score between 54 and 60, they will be considered as a low-risk grantee. And if they have a score between 42 and 53, then we will consider them as medium risk. And if they have a score of less than 41, it will be a high risk pool. And then when we do that and we create these groups, all the LEAs that are in the low risk pool will go through the sequential sampling method that I just described in my previous slide. So they're divided in 4, and we select the group in year 1, and the size of the grant will determine if it is a desk or a field review. But if the LEA is a medium risk, then they are removed from that group. So they go through a different cycle. So, and then under the plan, it will be a fiscal monitoring at least one time every year. And then the size of the grant will again determine if it is a desk or a field review. And when the LEA is in the high risk pool, they will go through the fiscal monitoring every year until they are removed. And what is the benefit of this selection method it's that grantees with high risk pool are prioritized in the monitoring process. So if there is a need for assistance now, they're not gonna wait 3 years from now. Now I will move on to the annual risk assessment. So as I said earlier, we have an annual risk assessment, and we developed the model using 10 fiscal risk indicators to assess the potential of non-compliance with state, local, and federal regulations. And I'll go over the risk indicators that we used last year for our first risk assessment. And why did we select that? The first one was the date of the last fiscal monitoring visit. Why? Because an LEA that goes through fiscal monitoring, that means they had a chance to get some advice, guidance, and they implemented some changes, they are less likely to make the same mistake. So that is a factor that could lower or increase the risk of non-compliance. We also have turnover of staff, program staff or fiscal staff. By program staff, I mean special education directors. And by fiscal staff, we mean business officials. A new person in the position trying to learn a new job are more likely to make mistakes, because I mean, when you're new, you only know what you know. So it's a risk factor that is incorporated in the risk assessment. We also have the maintenance of effort failure. How often the LEA failed their MOE test over the last 3 years? The next one is the result of the annual audit findings. So under the Idaho code, every LEA have to have an external audit, and they have to submit their audited financial statements to the department. So we use the result of the finding to make some assessment on the risk. Okay, the next risk indicator was the size of the grant award. When an LEA receives a small amount of grants, as you know, in the special education community, they tend to use their money more for salaries and benefits. And then as they get more money, then, well, they start allocating a portion of their grants for supplies, equipment, capital expenditures. So, you know, when we have an LEA getting more money, starting to spend their money on other line items, their accounting becomes more complicated, which is also a good indication of a higher risk. The next one is data reporting integrity. LEA report their expenditures to the state departments in 2 applications. They do it when they request reimbursement for the grants. And then they do it annually when they submit their IDA online application. And then we do a comparison to see if there are any discrepancies between the expenditures reported in our grant reimbursement application and our grant application. And then the next risk indicator is the size of the carryover. If an LEA tends to carry over a big portion of the grant from 1 year to another year, it is also a good risk indicator. And then we have the age of the financial management system. So if they have a new financial or accounting system, trying to learn the system, there is a possibility of making mistake because when the system is new, I mean, you're still trying to learn all the tricks. And then the last risk indicator was the implementation of policies and procedures at the LEA level. So when it was time to do our first risk assessment, we run into a situation. We didn't have information regarding the date of the last fiscal monitoring visit because we didn't have a systematic way of doing our monitoring. So if we wanted to score our LEAs, I mean, a lot of them would have been penalized. And we also did not collect information regarding the age of the financial management system. So as a result, we just decided to give them full credit on those two risk indicators for the first risk assessment. And obviously, as we grow, this will change because now we start collecting more information. And then this is a table showing the result of the risk assessment that was done last year in October 2017. And as you can see, we had 7 LEAs that were high risk. We had 95 medium risk and 42 low risk. And if you remember in one of my previous slides, I said that LEAs that are in a medium risk pool go through fiscal monitoring at least one time every 2 years. So if you divide 95 by 2, it's 42 to 43. Then with the limited amount of resources that we have here at the department, it was going to be impossible. So we created subcategories within the medium risk pool. And you see that we now created a high range, mid range, and low range under the medium risk category. And all the LEAs that are in green were being treated as low risk grantees. LEAs in yellow and orange were treated as medium risk, and the LEAs in red were high risk. After doing that, we were able to develop a more realistic fiscal monitoring schedule for FY 2018. So I also wanted to share with you some numbers just to give you an idea of where LEAs were standing. So the lowest score that we recorded during the first risk assessment was 38 out of 60. We only had 1 LEA. And then the highest score was the maximum amount of points, 60 out of 60. And we had 8 LEAs scoring 60. The average risk assessment score for all our LEAs was 50.31. Next table is a ranking. This is the average score per risk indicator of all our LEAs. And if here you can see that we had more problem when it comes to data reporting integrity, the way our LEAs were reporting their expenditures in the two systems. And then you see all the lists for audit and staff turnover and so on. That is just good information that I wanted to share. So now let's talk about our fiscal monitoring activities. Like I said, we were able to come up with a realistic fiscal monitoring schedule for FY 2018, and we were able to complete 16 field visits. And as of today, 9 of them are closed, and we still have 7 outstanding. That means we are working with the LEA on corrective action plan so that they can resolve their findings. And we also had 19 desk reviews. And as of today, 9 out of the 19 have been closed, and we have 10 that are still open, working with LEAs on finding resolution. And like you see, we did 16 field visits, and we were able to do 16 field visits in 6 local trips. We just grouped LEAs that were in the same region, and we just had 1 trip in the region. We will visit LEA number 1 on Monday, visit LEA number 2 on Tuesday, and maybe LEA number 3 on Wednesday, and we come back. So by limiting the number of travel, we were able to visit more. So when we complete the fiscal monitoring, we issue a report. And the report includes findings if applicable. And the LEA has 90 days to respond with a corrective action plan when they get their findings. And then after 90 days, if we try to work out with them. And then if after 90 days we don't hear from them, then we start looking at options to use enforcement mechanism that we have available under the Code of Federal Regulation, just to encourage them to, resolve or address their findings. So last year was the first year. It was the implementation year, but going forward, our goal is to start our fiscal risk assessment in October, and then start with the desk and field reviews from November through April, because last year we didn't start doing our reviews until February. So we tried to do 35 reviews in pretty much 4 or 5 months. But this year we were able to start our reviews in November. So we had 3, and then we'll have another one here in December. So it's going good. And that's the goal, that to do it like that every year going forward. Now let Dean take over from here.
All right, thank you, Anthony. I'm going to cover the Kansas portion of moving from that IDA fiscal monitoring to an integrated accountability system. In Kansas, we began the journey a while back now to move to an integrated accountability system, with the goal of having one non-punitive monitoring system for all districts with one consistent message. And this is kind of getting back to what Anthony already talked about with regards to the goal at the end of the day is really about providing technical assistance and improving results. And while we started with a risk-based system in our fiscal monitoring a number of years ago, we did switch to, we've since integrated that into our broader technical assistance and oversight system, our Kansas Integrated Accountability System, KIOS. And I'm going to talk a little bit more about what that looks like here in just a moment. But the real impetus for the change is that there is an inverse relationship between our capacity to provide technical assistance and the risk thresholds that we set. In a world of, if we had infinite resources, we wouldn't have to align this in the way that we have in terms of managing our resources. But by managing and by integrating, we not only find better uses of our resources, but we find some alignment that allows us to improve results for kiddos. And I'm going to go through some specific examples here towards the end. So the first thing to understand is that this is a process that does take time, and it never actually stops. It's a constant improvement loop of learning from what we've done in the last year, learning from each other, from other states, and incorporating that into an improved process for the following year. Our integrated accountability system, unlike our levels of determination reporting for IDA or the various indicators that we have to report for the ESEA, the Elementary and Secondary Education Act, this is not tied to any specific federal reporting. This is an internal tool and an internal process that we use to make sure that we are delivering the most effective technical assistance to those LEAs that need it the most. And as a result, because it is an internal process, we do have the flexibility to revise and tweak from year to year in a way that we can't do for some of these other indicators. It really is focused on meeting that need and not for something that we want to put out more broadly. But just for a timeline, just to kind of give you some perspective, for us, the process of truly integrating across our ESEA and IDA programs, fiscal and program, really began early in 2013, shortly after the Uniform Grant Guidance began to go into effect. But it was a long process with a lot of planning on the front end, because we determined early on as we were talking through this as a team and working through it that if we rolled it out before we were ready, it was going to fail. So we spent a lot of time calibrating and in those initial years, not putting too much impetus or too much weight on the results, allowing us to have flexibility to really kind of fine tune in the out years as we saw data coming in and really kind of calibrating the system. The other thing that I really want to say is that while I'm going to be talking about our integrated accountability system, this does not replace the need for fiscal monitoring. Fiscal monitoring does still happen for all of our programs. We do a coordinated fiscal monitoring across our ESEA and IDA programs. And on the screen right now, what you see is a sample of one of the questions that makes up that self-reported monitoring that we do through an online system. And it is sort of like what Anthony described in Idaho. It is done on a cohort basis. We have a 3-year cohort here that everybody completes at least every 3 years. We do sometimes have targeted monitorings that are more frequent, but everyone does it at least every 3 years. And it is composed of both cross-cutting questions that apply to all federal programs, as well as some program-specific questions. And just a note as well that the fiscal assessments, the fiscal monitoring tool is based heavily on both the Uniform Grant Guidance as well as EDGAR and GEPA, but also the Single Audit Compliance Supplement that is released annually from the Office of Management and Budget. And in particular, our cross-cutting questions do come from, many of our cross-cutting questions do come from the supplement. So we're just including this as a good resource to utilize if you aren't already. So let's talk a little bit about what makes up our integrated monitoring, and specifically some of the metrics that we look at. As we pulled together our integrated system for doing a risk-based analysis of all of our districts each year, we had to determine what it is that we're going to measure to make those determinations, to decide who we're going to, as part of that triage process, who gets the most intensive supports in any given year. So each year, every district, each year we analyze the data for every district and looking at these specific elements. And we do update this, as I said, from year to year, but broadly speaking, we looked at really 3 different pots. One under results, and we're looking at graduation data, test assessment data, student participation, participation of the 1%, and in this case, what we're talking about is whether or not districts are at or above the 1% to take what the DLM, college and career readiness, levels of determination, early childhood, least restrictive environments, et cetera. And in general, and I'm going to talk a little bit more about this in a second, we do weight results-based metrics heavier than some of these others. And I'm going to talk about that here in a moment as well. But we're not just looking at results. We are still looking at processes and change risk factors as well, because those can be telling of what might be coming up where we need to pay a little more attention. So for instance, changes in personnel and specifically leadership positions such as superintendents or program directors, new programs, for instance, if they are just beginning a Title III English learner program or something like, or maybe a preschool program, there's a higher risk because it's new. And newer changing systems. They may have restructured their system lately, which could be, it could be a very positive thing, such as, implementing MTSS or some other big systemic change. But anytime you change a system, you introduce risk just because it's different and there's more opportunities for things to fall through the cracks. And then finally, monitoring, the dotting the I's and crossing the T's. And so here we're looking at audit data, timely reporting of information, findings from across programs, including fiscal, timely correction, complaints and due process, emergency safety interventions, those sorts of things. And one thing I want to say before we move on to the next slide is that after our first year of really pulling this together, one of the things that we found was that if we looked at the results of, and results is probably the wrong word to use here. If we looked at the data for each of these different pots, results, change, monitoring, when we looked at that and we rank ordered all of our LEAs for the state for a given year, what we found was that if we looked at those results categories and kind of aggregated those together, so like your graduation, assessments, et cetera, and we also looked at the monitoring data, really those dotting the I's, crossing the T's, and if we put each of those into a separate aggregated pot and rank ordered them, what we found was that, sure, you would find some of the worst results, you'd find some poor results with poor compliance. But what maybe isn't so intuitive is that we also found some of the best compliance had profoundly bad results. And what that told us was that there were districts out there that were doing a good job of dotting the I's and crossing the T's, but they weren't getting the results for kiddos. And at the end of the day, and this is what the Uniform Grant Guidance goes to, is that at the end of the day, we are responsible for ensuring those results of the children, not and program outcomes, not just whether or not they're filing on time and dotting the I's, crossing the T's. Those things still have to happen. Compliance has to happen, but that's a bare minimum. That's not the end all of the expectations. So let's talk a little bit about how we in Kansas integrated our fiscal monitoring and elements into that bigger picture of what we call YODA, the Youth Outcome Driven Accountability. So we're going to share a couple slides here that just detail some of the specifics that we look at in Kansas. So the first one, integrating our fiscal monitorings. And what you're looking at here is a couple of snippets from an internal document that we use for each of our metrics that really details the specifics of what data elements go into that metric, as well as in the bottom right corner, you'll see what it is how we rate whether a district is low risk, medium risk, or high risk, as well as a weighting. As I mentioned previously, we assign a higher weighting typically to results indicators as opposed to compliance indicators. And so that first one that you saw was with respect to our fiscal monitorings. And this is a separate metric now looking at the fiscal correction. So the first is simply that first slide was simply looking at whether or not a district had a finding for non-compliance in one of the fiscal reviews. This one is looking at whether or not they had a finding and then did they in turn correct it. In this particular version of the document, I can tell this is a draft version or an earlier version because over on the rubric side, it has a risk of 1. I will tell you that that's not accurate. We do weight corrections much higher because while having a finding is a ding, for us, it's much more important as to whether or not they actually then correct it, because choosing not to correct a finding, and that's really how we frame it. If they choose not to correct the finding within the timetables and within our feedback to the districts, that's a much higher risk as a system. And then finally, we do, in addition to our overall fiscal monitoring, we do have a separate metric that is specific to single audits. And you'll note on this one that for our low risk, medium risk, and high risk, we do have it broken out such that a low risk is a district that has had an audit, a single audit review, but no findings. And the high risk is a district that had an audit and had one or more significant findings. But we have that third category, the medium risk, and a medium risk is simply a district that did not expend enough funds to require the CPA audit. Now, of course, we're still looking at them in different ways within our state, both from our state auditors as well as part of our fiscal monitoring. But for us, there is risk associated with not having that that more intensive CPA audit. So that is why they receive a medium risk. So I'm just going to run through a few specific examples, and these aren't hypotheticals. These are specific real-world examples just from the last 6 months to a year. This first one is a situation in which we have a district that operates a centralized early childhood center. They had Head Start, state-funded at-risk pre-K, special education pre-K, migrant program, and a fee-based special education program. The center had a single curriculum that was consistently implemented across all 20 plus classrooms, and yet we saw that the kiddos were being segregated by funding. And so this is an example where this program was flagged because of program findings with the early childhood least restrictive environment data, as well as early childhood outcomes data, both for IDEA. But through our integration with our fiscal team, we were able to address the issue, because as we worked with them in a coordinated manner and visited them, what we found was that it really wasn't, at the end of the day, a program issue. It was a funding issue and a misunderstanding of what is or isn't allowable, both with IDA funds as well as some of our state and other ESEA funds. And so our fiscal staff, working in conjunction with our program staff, were able to work with the district to work through how we can serve these kiddos in a more integrated environment and ultimately improve their outcomes. For this one, what we wanted to highlight is a situation in which we have a district that was designated as high risk under our youth outcome driven accountability system. That's our risk-based system. The district was flagged for multiple indicators across federal programs. District was not flagged specifically for fiscal monitoring issues, but when we did our program drill down, what we saw was that there were concerns that the federal funds that they did draw down were not being utilized to support their corrective action plans. And again, this is across both ESEA and IDA. So here again, what we were able to do was we were able to coordinate our intervention plans and tailor the fiscal side. So for instance, our various enforcement mechanisms, as well as additional conditions on the grants, we were able to tailor that so that the district was focused more into providing corrective services to their students that were aligned across both our IDA and ESEA programs, and that were more effective. And of course, this is ongoing and we continue to monitor it, but the reality is simply that by applying these additional structures and requirements to the district does push them into being more responsible. And this is further reinforced now with ESEA and the very explicit definition of evidence-based interventions, which we found to be very, very helpful. And this is not something we have to do for most districts. Most districts are more willing to implement effective interventions. This is something that we have to go to, though, occasionally for certain districts after the carrot doesn't work. In this example, we have a district that did not have any program, as part of their program monitoring, we didn't have anything pop up. We had no parental complaints or warnings. But what happened was, as part of the fiscal monitoring, a sample review of the LEA's expenditures revealed that the LEA had purchased a substantial number of weighted vests. And this in and of itself is not unallowable. But in our state agency, we do a lot of cross-training between our fiscal staff and our program staff, to where we really work together on just about everything. Fiscal staff regularly attend program meetings and vice versa. So because there's that common understanding of kind of what is or maybe isn't appropriate, or what maybe jumps out as just being weird or unusual, our fiscal team members looking over these ledgers and seeing these purchases of these weighted vests, it raised questions of, this is out of the ordinary, what's going on? And so having some additional conversations with our program staff, what we determined was that the reason they were purchasing these weighted vests, which do have an appropriate use in certain situations for certain children, what was happening though was that they were buying these very heavy vests for little kiddos, just as a means to essentially restrain them in their desks as a form of restraint, and not applying it the way that it was intended. So this is just an example where when you have that coordination and communication across teams, and I say across teams, we're all on the same team here, the special education and title services team, but across both the fiscal and program staff, and across ESEA and IDA, we are able to identify some of these things that maybe otherwise would have flown underneath the radar, and again, trying to improve the results for kiddos.
Thank you for watching this Cipher on-demand archived webinar. If you have any questions about the content in this presentation, please contact Cipher by email at cipher_info@wested.org or by phone at 855-865-7323. You can also find more information about Cipher at our website, cipher.wested.org, or on Twitter at @Cipher_IDEA.